Welcome back. The details. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi offered his sincere condolences to the victims of the shooting accident at Wadi Al-Kabir neighborhood in Muscat, praying to God to bless the deceased souls, wishing patience and solace to their families and a speedy recovery for the injured. This came on Saturday as President held a phone call with Oman Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, expressing Egypt's condemnation of this terrorist incident and full solidarity with the Sultanate of Oman in the face of terrorism and extremism. For his part, Sultan Haytham bin Tariq appreciated Egypt's positions in support of the Sultanate, stressing the depth and strength of the historical and brotherly bilateral relations and his country's keenness to continue consolidating the distinguished bilateral cooperation at all fronts. On behalf of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli headed on Saturday to Ghana's capital, Accra, to take part in the 6th mid-year coordination meeting of the African Union. Egypt is now chairing the new Partnership for Africa's Development Agency, NEPAD. Madbouli is expected to hold a string of bilateral meetings with a number of top African officials on the sidelines of the EU meeting. The Prime Minister will also tackle fundamental files related to development of efforts aimed at boosting economic integration among countries of the African Union. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in a statement Saturday that Egypt welcomed an advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, on the legal consequences of Israeli policies and brutal practices in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem or Al-Quds. Let's have a closer look.
Egypt has welcomed the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice, which deemed Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, as unlawful. Issued in response to a 2022 UN General Assembly request, the ICJ's opinion deems the continued Israeli occupation as a violence of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and a breach of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. The landmark opinion urges Israel to swiftly end the occupation, halt new settlement and remove existing settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Foreign Ministry statement said Egypt further welcomes the ICJ's call in all states and international organizations, including the United Nations, to refuse recognition of the Israeli occupation's legal standing. Statement noted that Egypt also commended the ICJ's request to the United Nations General Assembly and the UN Security Council to put in place the necessary measures to end this unlawful Israeli presence. The statement called on all international parties to implement the ICJ's advisory opinion, enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their legal right to self-determination and end the humanitarian suffering they are enduring. It added Egypt has called for an end to Israeli attacks on Gaza and unrestricted humanitarian aid access. Egypt reiterated its commitment to supporting Palestinian rights, including an independent state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital, advocating for a just and lasting peace based on a two-state solution.
Minister of Foreign Affairs and Egyptian Expats Affairs, Badr Abdelati, confirmed that the government made great efforts to make amendments aimed at creating supportive climate to invest and encourage private sector's investors. This came during a meeting held by Abdelati with a group of senior Ghanaian businessmen representing the sectors of construction, medicine, shipping, energy, food products, and agricultural projects. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ambassador Ahmed Abu Zaid said the Foreign Minister pointed that Egypt has adopted an ambitious economic program and has put improvement of investment climate at the top of its priorities. He asserted that the Egyptian government is working on enhancing the ability of the private sector to engage strongly and drive the economic growth by strengthening the partnership between the public and private sectors. The United Nations Highest Court said that Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and settlements there are illegal and should be withdrawn as soon as possible in its strongest findings to date on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Details follow.
The United Nations Highest Court said that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and settlements there are illegal and should be withdrawn as soon as possible in its strongest findings to date on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. The opinion by judges at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, known as the World Court, was not binding but carries weight under international law and may weaken support for Israel. The court said Israel's obligations include paying restitution for harm and the evacuation of all settlers from existing settlements. Meanwhile, in a swift reaction, Israel's foreign ministry rejected the opinion as fundamentally wrong and one-sided and repeated its stance that a political settlement in the region can only be reached by negotiations. The opinion also angered West Bank settlers as well as politicians such as Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, whose nationalist religious party is close to the settler movement and who himself lives in a West Bank settlement. Meanwhile, the head of the Benjamin Regional Council, one of the largest settler councils, said that the ICJ's opinion was contrary to morality and international law. ICJ opinion also found that the UN Security Council and General Assembly and all states have an obligation not to recognize the occupation as legal, nor render aid or assistance towards maintaining Israel's presence in the occupied territories. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry, meanwhile, called the opinion historic and urged states to adhere to it.
The United Nations Human Rights Office, OHCHR, warned that anarchy was spreading in the Gaza Strip with rampant looting, unlawful killings and shooting, and the population faces acute humanitarian crisis. Head of the OHCHR of Gaza and the West Bank, Adis Shankay, described unlawful killings and looting in the absence of law enforcement linked to Israeli dismantling of local capacity to maintain public order and safety in Gaza. Shankay, also who returned from a visit to Gaza on Thursday, said that the office has documented alleged unlawful killings of local police and humanitarian workers and the strangulation of supplies indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Anarchy is spreading. Jeremy Lawrence, also the spokesperson of OHCHR, said the conditions in Gaza has led to predictable and entirely foreseeable unraveling of the fabric of society in Gaza, setting people against one another in a fight for survival and tearing communities apart. And to continue with the situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip, Israeli occupation forces continued their aggression on the Gaza Strip for the 288th day. The genocide war, which resulted in the killing of more than 38,848 civilians of the Palestinians, mostly women, children and minors, and injured tens of thousands of others during the last 9 months, starting last October. Details follow.
Israeli occupation forces continue their aggression on the Gaza Strip for the 288th day, killing and wounding scores of Palestinians in sporadic areas in the Strip. Meanwhile, occupation's artillery shelled Tal el-Hawa neighborhood and comes in a Nusayrat camp, central Gaza Strip. Medical sources said the search for the missing is undergoing after the Israeli bombardment. Israeli forces bombed parts of central Gaza Friday, killing at least 8 Palestinians in the camp area, while fighting with Hamas fighters raged in Rafah in the south, where health officials said another 5 residents were killed. Into the 10th month of war, Israel's aerial and tank shelling of central Gaza has intensified in the past week, killing dozens. Residents said the Israeli army blew up dozens of homes in the past 3 days. Palestinian health officials said 8 people were killed in 2 separate Israeli airstrikes on 2 houses earlier on Friday. In Rafah, where Israel said it aimed to dismantle the last battalions of Hamas's armed wing, residents said fierce gun battles were heard in central and western areas. Medics said 5 people died in Israeli fire and 3 bodies were moved to Nasser Hospital. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a long-sought ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was within sight, saying negotiators were driving towards the goal line. At least 38,848 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's offensive since then, according to the Gaza health authorities.
Israeli occupation forces stepped up military measures on the Taysir boundary east of Tobas in front of those heading to Aghwar, which created a crisis for vehicles. The boundary linking West Bank of Aghwar witnesses strict check and measures on passing vehicles. Meanwhile, a number of occupation armored vehicles stormed 2 suburbs in southern axis of Tulkarm amid fierce clashes. The occupation forces also detained 2 young Palestinians in a town in southern Jenin city, followed by clashes there.